Well, hello, everybody. My name is Adrian Untermyer, and welcome once again to the official podcast of the Historical Society of the New York Courts. You know, I'm down here today on the banks of the Passaic River in Newark, New Jersey, overlooking the New York City skyline, way in the background. And whether you're down on the docks or in the teeming metropolis of Manhattan, the themes of money and power, cops and robbers, have followed us through the ages, and we are so fortunate to have a guest here with us today, John Oller, who wrote a very interesting series of books on both of those topics, weaving in New York City history, New York State history, and of course, legal history. His first book, White Shoe, covered the story of how Wall Street corporate law came to be in the turn of the last century. And his newest book, Rogues Gallery, just released a couple of weeks ago, covers the interplay between cops like Clubber Williams and the robbers who played that essential cat and mouse game throughout old New York before, during, and after. So buckle up for a very interesting conversation brought to you in coordination with the Woodlawn Cemetery Conservancy, where I'm proud to serve as treasurer, and the Historical Society of the New York Courts. So with that, let's go straight to my conversation with John Oller, author of White Shoe and Rogues Gallery.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and thank you to the Woodlawn Tuesday Night Book Club. Now, when you think of, I'll call them cops and robbers, you typically, I would think in terms of good guys and bad guys, I suppose, depending on your view of the police these days. But either way, the two books I'm here to talk about tonight, White Shoe and Rogues Gallery, raise the question, who are the cops and who are the robbers? Who are the good guys and the bad? Let's start with White Shoe first. It's the story of a group of early Wall Street lawyers who revolutionized the legal profession and American big business in the process during the Gilded Age, which ran roughly from 1875 to about 1910. It was also known as the Progressive Era, which extended a bit longer to about 1920 with the coming of Prohibition and the women's vote. Now, naturally, as lawyers, this group of men, and yes, they were all men back then, would be considered on the side of the law. And yet, they also served the robber barons, men like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. So some people might consider these lawyers closer to robbers than cops. Now, in Rogues Gallery, you have a similar situation. The rogues were truly bad, although interesting dudes, including a couple of bank robbers buried at Woodlawn, and I speak of the Hope brothers, Jimmy and his son, Johnny, who were participants in the biggest bank robbery in New York City history, the Manhattan Savings in Greenwich Village in 1878. And here's Johnny and Jimmy. Johnny is in the upper left, he's the son. Jimmy is in the upper middle, he's the father and the chief bank robber in the group. But the cops in the Rogues Gallery also did a lot of robbing too, of illegal operators such as prostitutes, gamblers, and saloon keepers who sold on Sunday when they weren't supposed to, all of whom had to pay for the privilege, and the cops called it a license, of doing business. These were essentially extortion payments, and they made a lot of cops rich, including one Alexander Williams, better known as Clubber. Next slide, please. Okay, who's also buried at Woodlawn. He got his nickname from the 26-inch club, wooden club. It was a locust club, they called it, that he used to bash people's heads in. He came up on charges of brutality and graft more than 200 times, but never lost his badge. And incidentally, he was defended in those police hearings by one of the White Shoe lawyers in my book. Okay, but businessmen loved Clubber Williams because he kept the peace in a very, very violent era. So you tell me, is Clubber Williams a cop or a robber? Now, the next slide, we'll see another Woodlawn fellow, Clubber's partner in graft, that is crime, for a while, until he turned to become a snitch on his fellow cops by the name of Max SCHMITTBERGER. Once he became a snitch, he was forbidden to march in the annual police parade, which was a big deal back then, and he was actually booed and hissed when he came up on his horse, and then they banned him altogether. Now, while the subject matter of these two books is different, lawyers in one and police and rogues in the other, I submit that there's a similar theme running through both. For the one thing, the obvious similarity is both books are set in New York City, and both cover the same Gilded Age, progressive era time period of roughly 1870 or so to 1915 or 1920. And in both books, we also see the birth and flowering of the professional class, lawyers in White Shoe and the police in Rogues Gallery. And by that, I mean that both groups, lawyers and police, started to apply more scientific or at least technocratic/bureaucratic systems than those that govern most of the 19th century. And this drive for modern efficiency, if you will, was one of the guiding themes of the progressive era. You had efficient but monopolistic conglomerations like Standard Oil and US Steel, both featured in White Shoe, who were really the Googles and Facebooks of their day. In White Shoe, we also see evidence of that drive for efficiency in the development of the famous Cravath system, named for Paul Cravath, leader of the firm now known as Cravath, Swaine and Moore. As an aside, Cravath, as a young lawyer, got his start representing George Westinghouse in his war with Thomas Edison over AC currents versus DC currents and which one was going to control the future. Westinghouse actually won that war. There's been a movie on it. There's another one supposedly in the works. In any event, Cravath gave birth to what's known as the Cravath system, and it's still used today. The essence of it is that instead of having little 1 or 2 person partnerships and a bunch of unpaid clerks who never went to law school, which was the predominant methodology in the 19th century, and in that system, the partners kept all the clients to themselves. They didn't share them with each other. Instead of that, Cravath's idea was you build a large organization. You hire the law students from the best schools, you train them on the job as associates, as they came to be known, and either promoted them to partner in 7 to 8 years back then, or sent them on their way. It was really, in his design, a meritocracy, as opposed to the old system, which was kind of a nepotistic system. Under the Cravath system, the partners are partners for life, and they share clients, they share profits, and it's the model still used today in most major law firms, as well as accounting firms and consulting firms. Now, it's undergone some changes around the edges. Partners move around a lot more from one firm to another, which almost never used to happen. And the exclusive WASP club that populated the early Wall Street firms is obviously by the boards. It's much more diverse today, especially with women who make up more than 50% of the associate class in many firms. And whereas Adrian's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Untermyer, whom you all know, all of the Woodlawn people at least know, and who's featured in my White Shoe book, was once the only high-powered Jewish corporate partner on Wall Street. And yet the old discrimination against Jews and Catholics among the White Shoe firms began to melt away around the 1950s and was pretty much gone by the late 70s, early 80s. And you don't hear much talk today of, quote, Jewish firms or WASP firms, although surprisingly, the term White Shoe is still used, although I think more as an indicator of quality than anything. Another good guy versus bad guy theme in White Shoe is how the robber baron lawyers often switch sides to work for the government in going after their former clients. A case in point is George Wickersham, an early founder of the firm of Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft, who became the Attorney General and Chief Antitrust Prosecutor for President William Taft, whose brother was a law partner of Wickersham's. And here we see in a popular magazine of the time, George Wickersham as Attorney General terrorizing a bunch of Wall Street men. Okay, switching back to Rogues Gallery, you also see there the professionalization of the NYPD. It starts with an Irish detective, the fellow on the far left here, named Thomas Burns, who gained his fame solving the Manhattan savings heist, the one that Jimmy and Johnny Hope were involved in, though he never did succeed in putting Jimmy Hope behind bars for it. Tom Burns introduced such innovations as the daily lineup, the rogues gallery, which were mugshots so that cops and victims could identify the criminals, and the so-called third-degree method of interrogation, both physical and more so for Burns, psychological, if you want to consider that an innovation. It's, obviously frowned upon today, although I have no doubt that it still goes on at times and in places. Then you have Teddy Roosevelt as head of the NYPD Police Commission starting in 1895, introducing things like the bicycle squad, which was the forerunner of the traffic bureau, a pistol practice for cops who couldn't hit the side of a barn before that, telephone call boxes in the street, and most important, perhaps, merit hiring for police. They used to have to pay the higher-ups and the politicians a lot of money, thousands of dollars, to get their initial job or further promotions. Again, this element, this concept of meritocracy manifests itself in a guy we'll see, I think, a little later, John McCullough. He was a favorite of Teddy Roosevelt. He was the first police chief of consolidated New York City, which came together in 1898 with the merger of all the boroughs. And as an aside, Roosevelt is a major character in White Shoe as well. He was friends with many of the big name lawyers, including Cravath. He was a trust buster, and his Panama Canal, the ultimate symbol, I would say, of efficiency in the Gilded Age progressive era, was greatly facilitated by William Nelson Cromwell, who's buried at Woodlawn and is the progenitor of the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm. You may have heard of them. And then finally in Rogues Gallery, at the end of the Gilded Age, things like fingerprinting and blood typing come in. Before that, it was almost exclusively detective legwork that got crimes solved. Now, at the same time the police were professionalizing, so too were the rogues. If you remember the movie Gangs of New York, starring Leo DiCaprio, which took place just before and during the Civil War, the gangs were mostly a bunch of street rowdies. And contrary to what the movie shows, they didn't really use guns much. But during the Gilded Age, that is post-Civil War, pre-Prohibition, the gangs became much more organized, hierarchical in structure, and lethal. Crime became essentially a business for them. And there was a progression from the early Irish gangs, which also modernized, and then the Jewish gangs, and then the Italian gangs, kind of mimicking the pattern of immigration throughout the late 19th century. A bit of Chinese gangs, although not very much, because Chinese immigration was greatly restricted at that time. And of course, it all culminates in the mafia, which takes place in New York City, or has its birth in New York City, I should say, around 1900. It was formed by a guy named Giuseppe Morello, otherwise known as the Clutch Hand, and that's him there. In the next slide, we'll see a couple of famous NYPD cops. Joe Petrosino on the far left, the Italian Sherlock Holmes, headed up the Italian squad, one of only a handful of NYPD detectives who could speak Italian. And at the far right is Art Carey, who was sort of a murder expert. He was the first head of the homicide squad. And in between is a Morello gang member known as the Ox, who's being carted away to prison. Gone by this time were the days of what I'll call the gentleman bank robber or safecracker, like Jimmy Hope, who was commonly a well-dressed man who looked like a broker or insurance man, and who preferred brains to brawn. So to sum up, both books are really about how the professional classes on the side of the law modernized themselves in moving from the 19th to the 20th century, and how the things they had to deal with, huge corporations in the case of the lawyers and structured criminal enterprise in the case of the police, expanded and modernized along with them on a parallel track. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Adrian for a little back and forth and discussion and Q&A.
Wow, John, that was an absolute treat. And on behalf of everybody who's joining us here live in the Zoom tonight and on the recording up online, we really want to thank you for contributing to the conversation about gumshoes. I think today that is particularly front of mind, given the horrific attacks that we witnessed in the New York City subway system this morning. The militaristic precision that goes into having a modern organized force and the ability to prevent atrocities and track down those who are responsible. Obviously, there is some bad that came along with that. We'll certainly discuss that this evening, but a tremendous amount of good and innovation came with that as well. And all of that resides permanently at Woodlawn with so many of the figures that you brought to light. And I wanted to start off the conversation sort of by tracing things back a little bit, right? We're here for a cemetery conservancy. And we're talking about crime and jails, not always the best topics that people want to think about after dinner and after work. But there's a progression there, sort of the typical view of the tombs in Lower Manhattan, where a lot of the ruffians who we described earlier in the conversation ended up being placed pending trial and serving out sentences in some of these Victorian facilities, and cemeteries with the iron gates. It's just such an interesting aesthetic. And I was hoping you could sort of comment a little bit about the buildings where all of this sort of took place, the courthouses, the jails in Lower Manhattan, and talk a little bit about some of those places and some of those faces that we saw in there.
Yeah, well, some of these places still exist. There is the police building down at 240 Center Street, a magnificent building. I have a friend who lives there, a good friend who lives there. That came into being in around 1909, I think, so sort of at the tail end of this period that we're talking about. Before that, the police building was on Mulberry Street, 300 Mulberry. It no longer exists. There are still some haunts, I'll call them, of famous murder sites. There's a couple hotels in New York where there were grisly murders that took place. That Art Carey, the guy I mentioned as the homicide squad, had investigated. The infamous 5 Points can still be sort of seen. You can go down there next to the Pearl Street Courthouse and see where the 5, I think now it's 3, but at one time it was 5 streets converged, and now it's a park and a playground. Not far from that is the site of the old Tombs prison, which was an Egyptian style, almost mausoleum, huge structure. And it's now, there's a little park there about 5 minutes from the 5 Points. You can still see places on Mulberry Bend where the Irish gang, the Wyos, hung out. And there, if you go to my book, I have a lot of these, noted in a map. There are also a couple other books out there, places for, of course, some of these people run guided walking tours, and you can see some of these places. But there's a fair number of places that still exist. Mostly downtown, mostly below 14th Street.
Right, and you're talking about haunts and you're talking about mausoleums. What a wonderful way to bring it home to the cemetery, John. Not sure if that was intentional or not, but we'll give you the credit nonetheless. Okay. There was another figure who sort of haunted some of those judicial mausoleums downtown, and I believe she's buried in Woodlawn as well. A woman by the name of Rebecca Salome Foster, but better known as the Tombs Angel, for her visitations with folks in the tombs. Who was Miss Foster, John?
I mean, I've heard of her, but I didn't include her in my book. I know that she supposedly ministered to the, the inmates and tried to make their miserable lives in that place a little less miserable. I mean, it was really an awful place to be. The smell, the rats, the conditions were, many times worse than what you might think of Rikers Island in the 70s or 80s.
That's correct. And as a testament to her ministry, visitors to 60 Center Street, New York County Courthouse downtown, there's a beautiful marble monument newly restored to Salome Foster's memory, just another person who falls into that sort of Woodlawn umbrella. And before we talk a little bit more about Woodlawn and bring in a very special guest this evening, I do want to make mention of somebody you spoke about earlier, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Untermyer. My understanding from reading White Shoe is that a lot of Jewish attorneys found themselves referred to as members of the lower bar, almost a grubbier type, as we discussed in other Woodlawn events. Can you tell us a little bit more about that lower bar dynamic, and tell us also about Samuel Untermyer and his legacy?
Yeah, well, the lower bar, the term shyster kind of developed from that. It was a derogatory term, but that's kind of where it comes from. Obviously, the Jewish lawyers, first of all, they couldn't, for the most part, they could not get into the Harvards and Yales of the day, and the big white shoe firms only hired law students out of Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. So there were very few Jewish lawyers who were, candidates for white shoe firms, even if the firms had been willing to accept them, which they weren't. So they kind of formed themselves into their own little, sometimes mostly little Jewish law firms. Untermyer started out doing corporate work, and he got into trouble a couple times with kind of somewhat. He was accused of fraud, but he turned on a dime, and I think that played into his later vociferous pursuit of as not a white shoe lawyer, but a white hat lawyer, going after the big corporations, going after people like J.P. Morgan. We cross-examined famously in some committee hearings on the control of money in America. So Samuel Untermyer really became a very strong liberal champion of the underdog. Now it cuts off in my book, and I'll pick it up in the epilogue a little bit. He was accused of sympathizing with the Germans in World War I, and there's something to that. He wasn't a total sympathizer, but he had some dealings which were, I think, he regretted, and he became very strongly anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi, and he wasn't going to make that same mistake again. So he was very well known as a strong advocate of America really getting involved in Europe in World War II.
Right, and thank you, John, and thank you for that honesty too, because I think oftentimes when we think of Samuel Untermyer, we think of the lush and lavish Untermyer Gardens in Yonkers, New York, another National Historic Landmark, now being brought back to life, or the fountain in Central Park, but we don't always talk about those darker moments. And one thing I appreciated from your book was a look to later in Samuel's life, where he almost nostalgically looked back on his life in the South, and as a boy stepping into the street and saying something along the lines of "Hail Jefferson Davis."
Yes.
Right. Yeah. That level of extensive research and historical honesty is certainly what made that book stand out to me. And so glad that you're here with us this evening. And just a reminder to everybody who's joining us live via the Zoom, please do place your questions in the chat, your comments in the chat, so we can address them. But I would like to bring in a very, very special guest to liven up our conversation. A woman who literally created her own job description and then took the job, which I think is a noble thing to do. And it is a gift to all of us because it brought to Woodlawn one Susan Olson, our Director of Historical Services, who is in the job and livening up Woodlawn for many years now on our trolley tours and many others. Please do go online and check out our upcoming tours and events so you can engage with Susan in real life. But Susan, I think you've had some thoughts about the formation of law firms and partners and how that all happened. Susan, please unmute yourself and say hello.
As far as Woodlawn goes, we started with White Shoe. And of course, you came and talked to some of our interns about having your grandfather in a book before we went to Untermyer Gardens. And with the book, like any book we get that's new, we quickly index who at Woodlawn is buried in there. And for me, I think one of the things that was so surprising was kind of the firm swapping. And what I learned from the book and from John, and I'll have him go on about it, is the size of firms. We assume firms are like they are today. And I think that's one of the things that I learned was the emergence of the legal profession. When did law schools really come about where you were really a lawyer as opposed to I'm studying the law? And then from there, John, how were these early partnerships founded? And how did that system work before Cravath came up with what we think of as law firms today?
Yeah, well, I should make clear that even Cravath, even the early firms that Cravath was involved with, and CROMWELL and these other guys, they were pretty small firms, 6 to 10 to 15 to maybe 24. I mean, they were nothing like the 1,000 lawyer firms that we have today. And yet they were considered at the time, anything more than 2 or 3 lawyers was, considered a law factory back then. And I think most, before these firms, as I said, it was sort of ad hoc partnerships of a couple guys in an office who weren't really partners in any true sense. They just shared office space, and they didn't share clients or profits, and they hired their own clerks, usually a friend or relative. And Cravath came along and said, this is not going to do. Our clients are J.P. Morgans and Rockefellers and Westinghouses. They are organizing into big institutions with hierarchies and stressing efficiency, et cetera. And if we're going to represent them, we got to do the same thing. And that's kind of how it started. As you mentioned, firm jumping, I think in the early days, yes. There was a firm called the Walter Carter firm that was sort of the farm team or kindergarten for Wall Street lawyers. And Cravath was an associate in that firm. Charles Evans Hughes was an associate and then became a partner in that firm. And a guy named Hornblower, who went on to form my old firm, Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, he was a partner in that firm. He got upset with his compensation. Some things don't change. And he stormed off with another guy named Byrne, and they formed Hornblower and Byrne, and that eventually became Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Cravath stayed with the Carter firm. Hughes stayed with the Carter firm. Cravath then leaves to join a firm run by one of William Seward, the old Secretary of State for Lincoln, one of his nephews, I believe. That was known as the Seward firm. That morphs eventually into the Cravath firm. Hughes stays with the little Carter firm, goes off to the government, becomes a Supreme Court justice and presidential candidate, comes back to the Carter firm, which then gets renamed in his honor as Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed, a firm that still exists today.
Well, John, you just added to our list. Seward's nephew is buried at Woodlawn also, with a fabulous medallion on his grave. So that's, again, pretty exciting to me. One of the things that, I want to share with the group, that if everyone has not read these books, what's remarkable of the way that John puts it together is in many ways it's like a novel. He really goes in depth about these characters and their personalities as well as their adventures or, their crimes and their successes and that. But one of the most fascinating folks, and I love that slide of Cromwell with his curly tuft of hair, because it's not exactly how you depict a big, white shoe lawyer. Of course, what we learn from the books is that Cromwell goes with international business. And I think that's what fascinated me, was that these guys were so proficient in business and creating the laws today, as well as, defending and their clients and making money for their clients. But what surprised me most in our Woodlawn research is that Cromwell did not plan for the afterlife. He didn't build his mausoleum. He left it to the firm and John Foster Dulles to do that. Does that seem typical, John, of what Cromwell would have done? And he seemed like a man who planned everything.
Yeah, it is a little, it's odd and yet it isn't. Dulles was his protege, and Dulles, maybe even more so than Cromwell, really developed the international global practice that kind of dominates big law firms today, or is at least a big part of big law firms today. Cromwell was very particular about things, his legacy in France. He was a big Francophile, and he had a bust there and a portrait, and he didn't like him, so he made him redo it. And he gave a lot of money away. He founded this society in New York that still exists for the study of, I forget what it is, colonial law or something like that. But yeah, I would have thought that he would have taken more care about his U.S. burial legacy, but I think he trusted Dulles quite a bit. And Dulles comes in kind of toward the end of my book, and he's obviously more famous. He's more known for his Secretary of State years under Eisenhower as being a fervent anti-communist, but he was actually kind of a liberal when he was younger. He knew and respected Woodrow Wilson, and he went over to the Versailles Paris peace talks at the end of World War I, and as an associate, he was drafting some of the main documents and making some of the main oral pitches. So very talented guy, and there's been many books written on him.
Now, speaking of talented guys, we have Gary Malone on the line, who did write in the chat with a question. Gary's asking about this sort of period in American and New York City history where there's a tremendous commercial surge in New York, factories, immigrants, this entire melange, which results in a heightened level of urbanism as the 1800s turn to the 1900s. And we see the legacies of that as we walk around New York, of course, as well. So Gary is wondering how the growth of this urbanization of America in this time influenced that organization of the cops and the criminals and the lawyers that you were talking about. John, do you want to take a stab, and then maybe Susan, you can comment?
Well, I think, America in the 1800s was mostly an agrarian country outside of a few large cities. And you didn't have the need so much. It was just not as complex as it became when you had larger cities, larger corporations, and more people. So I think they kind of went along in parallel. The growth of the country, the expansion of urbanism, of industry, of finance, stocks, bonds, which really came in a big way after the Civil War. The floating of bonds to create railroads, which brought the country together, but a lot of those railroads then went bust, so created a lot of bankruptcy work for some of these early lawyers. It all kind of mushed together, I think.
Susan, what do you think about that urbanization and what it meant for the cops and the robbers and the lawyers as organization burgeoned?
Well, one of the things that John does so well in the books is he talks about how wealthy the policemen become. And he converts the dollars from their dollars to our dollars. These guys were multimillionaires. But when he talks about his primary character, Burns, the fact that he was big buddies with Jay Gould was astounding to me. That, can you imagine a cop getting stock tips from somebody? And that's how this policeman, because when they go through the whole corruption and this and that, he's like, no, I made my money. I wasn't doing corruption. I was getting stock tips from somebody I helped out. And I thought that was fascinating, was the diverse relationships that you show that the policemen have, from the prostitute on the street to Jay Gould.
Yeah. And the other thing was that these New York policemen, a lot of them were very well known to the public. I mean, you couldn't name the captain of the 19th precinct today in New York, but back then there was a lot of crime reporting. These guys were somewhat celebrities, guys like Burns and Williams and SCHMITTBERGER. They were on the front pages all the time. And when they got in trouble, when they got indicted, that was big news, and a lot of them got indicted. It was a smaller world, obviously. So they were well known within that world. And
some of these names loom large today. You mentioned PETROSINO earlier, the early police figure, and of course there's PETROSINO Square in Manhattan now, his namesake. So these people loomed large. These names really resonated, but
I want to talk about a name that really resonated with me tonight, Clubber. Susan wrote me earlier asking if any of us think that Clubber Williams character was likable in any respect. Susan, do you think he was a likable figure? And John, fill in the blanks after Susan's done sharing.
I think one of the things that is so fun about John's book is he talks about Clubber, who's beating everybody up, who's corrupt as can be. And then there's McCullough, who he refers to as a choir boy. And McCullough's success as a policeman doesn't last very long because he is this good guy and he gets thrown out as the head of the police department. Again, you have so much of Tammany Hall and the politics that balances out. But I love the fact that these two characters, I'm cheering for Clubber, the bad guy, as opposed to McCullough, the Boy Scout. Yeah. So, John, was that the public reaction too, or just the public?
Oh, I think Clubber was fairly popular with the public because he, he cleaned up crime, in a big way, and crime was pretty violent back then. I think on a per capita basis, there were more murders and violent crimes in New York back then than maybe at any time since, it with possible exception of the sort of the crack era, cocaine era of the early 90s. But the homicide rate was very high, and Clubber cracked down literally. And interestingly, he was not a Tammany guy. He was a Republican. He was kind of a white shoe cop. And he did one good thing. I don't think he's very laudable myself, but he did one good thing, which is he paved the way for Joe Petrosino. He got him a waiver of the height requirement, which back then was 5'8", and Petrosino was only 5'3". Petrosino started out, for all his later glory, as kind of a bagman for Clubber Williams down in Little Italy. And Clubber brought him up through the ranks, got him a job, and Teddy Roosevelt loved Petrosino. He, formed the Italian squad for him. There's one other guy I didn't mention, another corrupt guy. If it's possible to be more corrupt than Clubber Williams, I think Big Bill Devery was. He was a huge guy. He was the guy who forced McCullough out. And became the police chief after McCullough's brief tenure. Big Bill Devery, now he was a Tammany man through and through. And he used to hold court in his office, which was a bar down in, the Lower East Side. Interestingly, he formed a gambling partnership with a couple of New York bigwig gamblers and eventually ends up buying the New York, actually, I don't remember what their name was in Baltimore, but he moved the Baltimore franchise. I don't think they were known as the Orioles then, but he brought them to New York, named them the Highlanders, and ran them for a few years. They were very mediocre back then, and ends up selling them to Colonel Jacob Rupert in around 1918 or 19, just in time to buy Babe Ruth from Boston and create the New York Yankees.
Hey, Susan, brief digression, but do we have any other baseball figures at Woodlawn?
We have Frankie Fish, the Fordham Flash. We have Grantland Rice, the sports writer. It's not whether you win or lose, but how you played the game.
Oh,
He's
that's
in the
right.
Hall of Fame. And then we have Alex Pompez, who was a numbers runner and a scout, and he made it in with the Negro League. So we have 3 Hall of Famers.
That's fantastic.
Adrian, one of the things you need to think about as far as serving at Woodlawn is back in the day, to echo what John just said about the publicity, Woodlawn's board of directors decided we would not bury anyone who was put to death in the electric chair.
Oh, wow.
And then money talks. So we have 6 people put to death in the electric chair. And so far in our research, we found one person that was hung in the tombs. But probably the most infamous person, or one of the most infamous, is Charles Becker, the policeman who was put to death in the electric chair.
Yes.
And again, it's in one of those books that we first learn about Clubber and what's going on in the Tenderloin, and this cop who was caught with a gambling ring and accused of murder and put to death in the electric chair. The funeral was huge, and the board was so distressed about all the negative publicity we were getting because of criminals being buried at Woodlawn. And one of the things I will do to follow up on John's talk tonight is get into the newspapers and read about the Hope's funerals. I can't imagine that Jimmy and Johnny Hope didn't have big celebrated funerals. Their gravestone is so simple and so boring, but nonetheless, these guys were characters that everybody loved. They were the gentlemen bank robbers, brilliant people who planned and thought, architectural plans, the whole bit. The section on the early bank robbers and safecrackers is just fantastic. I love that part of the book.
I want to talk a little bit about a group that has come up here a couple of times. We spoke a little bit about cops dabbling into the world of bribery, and there was another group involved with quite a bit of bribery and other shenanigans in New York. It was once said by a historian that Tammany Hall started off with all the ritual and mumbo jumbo of a typical civic organization at the time, but then of course it bloomed into this graft machine. John and Susan, tell us a little bit about Tammany Hall and how that all sort of was working in the background during this era, before, during, and after, shall we say, because its legacy is still with us today.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, but people differ on Tammany Hall. I've talked to a couple of people who I referenced in the book as sources and who read parts of the book, and some of them are quite adamant that Tammany Hall gets a bad rap, that it was really the social safety net for poor immigrants at the time. It got them their jobs, it got them their Christmas turkeys, it took them out on the boat in the summer to what they used to call chowders. So they did a lot of good things, but yes, they rigged elections. Now, maybe they didn't have to rig them because they already had the votes for the most part, but they did all sorts of shenanigans to send people with fake names and into the ballot box and have them vote 3-4 times. They'd have their mustache on and then they'd shave the mustache and send them in again. So, they were, there was that aspect to them. And they had a huge degree of control over the cops, over the hiring of cops, over the promotion of cops. Their influence continued, beyond this period that we're talking about. I don't think it's great in the 30s and 40s. I think it sort of died out by then. Probably its heyday was, obviously Boss Tweed was Tammany, so he was, until he got his, hand caught in the cookie jar and went to prison. But it continued very strong beyond Boss Tweed for another 30, years at least.
Right, and the interface, of course, with justice was just so very present throughout the history of Tammany. The great Tammany author, shall we say? We know of his reminiscences because they've been published. George Washington Plunkett, of course, recalled how he would go in and have a word with the judge regarding the drunks and disorderlies, and magically they would be released. And he, of course, also referred to his Supreme Court justiceships, a very esteemed judicial post here in New York State, referred to them as this big plum, which you could reward a loyal foot soldier with during the Tammany years. I only know all this because I just finished writing a chapter on Tammany in our legal history of New York County. And I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat in just a moment. But we do have another question from that chat as we're mentioning it. The question is from Meg, and she's asking about technology, crime fighting tactics, blood typing and fingerprinting, sort of the CSI of that day, if you will. John, sort of take us behind the scenes on how these folks were solving crimes. What sort of stands out to you? What do you remember from your research?
Well, during the period that I covered, there really wasn't any. There was no such thing as modern forensics. The first fingerprinting case where anyone was convicted based on fingerprinting was, I think, 1911. Blood typing didn't come in until 1901, I believe. So for the most part, during the 30 or 35 years that I cover in the book, they really had nothing. They had a very crude ballistics forensics where they could take a bullet and say, yes, that could have come from that gun. It's consistent with coming from that gun, but they had no ability to take a bullet in a gun and say, this bullet came from that gun. So they really, the way they caught crooks was either caught them red-handed in the act, or they had eyewitnesses, and we all know how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be, or they extracted a confession from them by hook or by crook. So that those, or they had legwork, detective work, clues, which led to, and that was what Art Carey really pioneered, was the thought process of putting clues together and leading to someone. But you didn't to convict them. It was going to be circumstantial for the most part, unless you had a really solid eyewitness, to testify.
Yeah, and it brings to mind that seminal New York case, which gives us so much of our evidence law, People versus Molineux, where they were tracking down all of these poisons that were sent through the mails in a very methodical fashion. It's fascinating to think about how things worked back then. But we're talking about the cops, we're talking about the attorneys. Sort of a hybrid figure in that role is the prosecutor, and they of course are pursuing their cases in the courts. They're doing a little bit of gumshoe work themselves. And Susan, a more modern figure is buried at Woodlawn, actually out of Brooklyn, not out of the Bronx or Manhattan, as with many of our residents, that being Ken Thompson, the former Brooklyn DA who unexpectedly passed relatively recently after a battle with cancer. Susan, who was Ken Thompson and how did he end up at Woodlawn?
I don't have the slightest idea, Adrian.
There you go.
No, I know you. The fact that a Brooklynite would come to Woodlawn is, a pretty strong comment. And I think it was, his family. We have a tremendous African-American legacy at Woodlawn, mainly because of the number 4 subway connecting us to Harlem. And that's why so many figures from the Harlem Renaissance and then their families come in the next generation, et cetera. But Thompson, who did so many of the early, very controversial cases regarding the police and too many shootings and too many bullets and too many this, basically, the police were aggressive and using too much force, and Thompson was front and center on those cases, and just a remarkable guy. And we, of course, were incredibly honored that his family said, we want to bring him to Woodlawn. He's got a beautiful memorial with cameo photos and that. And just, again, surprising to us, sometimes Woodlawn gaining its reputation where people saying, that's where I want to be. I know I'm going to be visited, and I know I'm going to be included in the legal tour. And so we see, these remarkable characters who have made such an impression on our history be there. And for us, one of the things that John was talking to is kind of the concept of the have and have not, those who fought for the little guys and those who fought for the big guys. And it ranges from LaGuardia to Vito Marcantonio to a Robert Moses character, that some of the things that are discussed today, similar to Tammany Hall, those guys are there too. And again, it's that concept of the immigrant population and people representing the poor who have the American dream. And it's very fascinating in both of John's books where that is presented, that there is this issue in New York of, do you take care of the little guy or do you make the big guy bigger? And he does a beautiful job of kind of intertwining those issues of how the city grows.
Yeah, I saw a question from my friend Hal Kennedy about how judges got picked and who picked them and were they corrupt. The answer is yes, they were corrupt. Many of them. They were not picked by the white shoe firms. They were picked by Tammany. Most of the judges in the Gilded Age in New York were Tammany approved. And the reason being so that they could then let the Tammany crooks and their criminal cronies who enforced the election day fraud, so that they could let them out with little or no bail, which is, kind of an issue today.
That's
John, I
right.
want to ask a question about that. Did you find in your research on the firms, did the firm push an outstanding figure to politics? Because the whole concept of leaving your firm to go run for public office, how did you perceive that? Was it a push or was it a calling?
I think it was more the latter. I think that some of these guys were driven to public service by their own ideology, their own, in many cases, genuine desire to serve the public, to serve in government. Certainly Charles Evans Hughes, I would put in that category. I think Elihu Root was in that category. He was somewhat more conservative than Hughes. And the other guys, the other main characters in my book, I don't think ran for public office per se, but they served in government, like Wickersham. They served on international commissions and organizations. Cravath he founded the Council of Foreign Relations. He was a big internationalist. And it all kind of comes together, at least in White Shoe in World War I, where it was really this handful of White Shoe lawyers were very influential internationalists fighting the isolationist trend of staying out of war. And then they got involved in the battle with Wilson over the League of Nations, but I think they supported a League of Nations, but not Wilson's League of Nations. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think for me, I was looking at, did these people say the only way I'm going to change the law is if I make the law, and whether or not that prompted people to serve the public? Because today, how many politicians that are out there, successful politicians, are not lawyers? Just about everybody is.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think that's true. And another point I make is that the influence of White Shoe lawyers today is not nearly what it was, 100 years ago. I mean, these guys were well-known American public figures. They served as secretaries of state, secretaries of war, on the Supreme Court. You just don't, I think I have a line in there, the last true Wall Street White Shoe lawyer to serve in the president's cabinet was Cy Vance Sr. under Jimmy Carter.
Another Woodlawn lot owner. Not buried there, but another Woodlawn character.
Yeah, and I would most of these lawyers were what I would call moderate to liberal Republicans of the day, the Eastern liberal Republican establishment. There were a couple Democrats in there, but for the most part, that's what they were. And, starting in the 1980s, I would say, liberal Republicanism started to decline, and today it's almost non-existent. So a lot of their legal and political power derived from that, and it was an exclusive WASP club. They had their union league and their metropolitan clubs, and it was a very homogenous group. They did a lot of good things. They did some things that a lot of people would say were not so great, but they had influence.
John and Susan, the bell is getting a little close to 8:05, which would mark an hour of our conversation. So if folks are curious more about this jump from the bar to politics and the calculations that went into that, we had a great event recently that Woodlawn did with the Historical Society of New York Courts. And we talked about that exact topic, including when there was, of course, Samuel Untermyer's desire to be on the Supreme Court. But because of some of the issues that John spoke about earlier, he never ultimately got that post. So if you're interested in that conversation, those of you who are here live can find the link in the chat. And those of you who are watching the recording of this program, just Google for Woodlawn and Historical Society of New York Courts. You'll find it up on YouTube. But as we draw this evening's program closer to a close, John and Susan, we discussed a lot of figures here tonight, from Clubber to Samuel Untermyer to Cravath to everyone in between. So I'm just sort of curious, first starting with Susan, and then we'll wrap up with John. What grave are you headed towards the next time you're at Woodlawn, Susan?
I would say SCHMITTBERGER because it's obnoxious. You know, the fact that he promoted his wealth in such a way is just astounding to me. And to be known as the Squealer and still have this massive cross and, I mean, a very, very expensive monument. I think, you know, SCHMITTBERGER to me is, again, just a fascinating character, bragging about being the Squealer. We
But
don't
Susan,
have people out in New
Susan,
York.
what about Judge Schmuck?
That's a favorite for all our visitors. Of course, you know, and the legend has it that Judge Schmuck, somebody was going to change their name and appeared before him and he said, if I can live with my name, you can live with yours. Whether or not that's true, who knows? But nonetheless, a lot of photos are taken of the Schmuck Mausoleum.
There you go. And before we turn to John, I just wanted to mention that we do often give tours and events at Woodlawn almost every weekend. And one thing we did do recently was do that Legal Luminaries tour out in the trolley where we could go visit Judge Schmuck and so many others. So please do keep apprised of our upcoming events. The link to that is in the chat. And those of you watching the recording can find that on Woodlawn Conservancy's website. So John, closing out with you, we are so looking forward to welcoming you in person to Woodlawn. Which grave do you think you're going to visit?
I guess to be loyal, I would have to go to Hornblower's grave because he was the, you know, the founder of the firm. I wouldn't be here today without William Hornblower.
There you go. And of course, for me, it's going to be our family plot, the Untermyer family plot, which I understand is being restored continuously by Woodlawn's amazing staff in accord with conservation best practices and in partnership with the Untermyer Gardens Conservancy. So I was just there about a week ago and can't wait to go back along with every visit to Woodlawn. And if you do want to visit us, please do become a member and support us. And that'll get you set up with all sorts of emails on all of our upcoming happenings like this one, both virtual and online. So as we close here this evening, really want to thank John Oller, once again, the author of White Shoe and Rogues Gallery. Please do go to your bookseller of choice and go ahead and get both of those volumes. They make a great back-to-back read. John, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you.
And Susan Olson, Woodlawn's Director of Historical Services. Susan, we'll see you out on the trolley, huh?
Well, you'll see me in the library waiting for John's next book. I tell
There you go.
Thank you, John. I can't wait for your book on Dillinger.
All righty. So on behalf of the Woodlawn Cemetery Conservancy, I'd officially like to thank you for joining us this evening. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite the conversation with John Oller, author of White Shoe and Rogues Gallery, and Susan Olson, also of the Woodlawn Cemetery Conservancy, where I also serve as treasurer. If you like today's conversation, go out and buy John's 2 books at a bookstore of your choice, or go to your public library and check them out, although I know there's a waiting list for both. They're pretty popular these last couple years. And as a reminder, this program was brought to you by the Woodlawn Cemetery Conservancy and the Historical Society of New York Courts. You can find the former at Woodlawn Conservancy just by a Google search, and the latter by visiting history.newyorkcourts.gov. And I'm sure both groups would welcome an email sign up or even a donation from you. So thanks for joining us on this episode. And we'll see you next time on the podcast of the Historical Society of the New York Courts. Have a great day wherever you are. We'll see you again soon.